Well, good evening, everybody, both those online and those here in the building. It's really lovely to see you all and be with you all. We're pushing on in our studies tonight and moving on to David and focusing on David and the first lesson in a short series that we'll be doing on him. So we did obviously encounter David 2 lessons ago, where we looked at his encounters with Saul, and in particular, really from Saul's perspective and the fraught nature that God had anointed David to be his replacement, but had not yet allowed him to take the throne, and was prepared to wait for Saul's reign to play its way out. And we saw last week how that played out to great tragedy and devastation, really. And at the heart of that was really Saul's refusal to properly account for his behavior before God, and to humble his knee in obedience, and to recognize God, and God had withdrawn his spirit from him. So we'll probably pick up a little bit of that in the next this week and next week in our classes, but really we're wanting to focus on David and look at him, and we've spent plenty of time on Saul now, so this will be the first of 5 lessons on David. And so tonight we'll be focusing on 1 Samuel chapter 16 and chapter 17. There's a lot to say about David, and so that's why we will be spending a few lessons on this. Again, David, I'm sure, is one of the most iconic, probably the most studied characters of all the Old Testament. He really looms large. He's really almost like a fulcrum, and we could sort of, point out that even though the Old Testament is extensive and filled with so many characters that we sort of bounce from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses, and then to David in some ways, in terms of sort of the the tentpole characters that we see in the Old Testament. And of course David's lineage and influence, shadow, extends to the New Testament. We see him right there in Matthew chapter 1 in the lineage of Jesus. So again, all of this working to God's plan to bruise Satan on the head, ultimately, that plan he instituted from the start. David being a significant character, both as a historical figure, and also individually. And so what I want to look at, certainly in a lot of this, is really the individual character, the decisions, the behavior of David, both the positive things and obviously the negative things as well, and to draw those out. And no doubt we'll touch on that sort of wider influence that David exhibits, but really we want to focus a bit more on the granular detail in some of these classes. And so tonight we want to look at the beginnings, obviously, and again I think the 2 accounts that we'll look at tonight are perhaps amongst the most familiar. We never know what people know of the Bible, but I suspect certainly when I was a child we were taught David's anointing, and David and Goliath would be known by, I would suspect, many people who would have a very cursory or passing knowledge of the Bible. We use the sort of idea of David and Goliath to represent any sort of underdog versus not so much a warm favorite, but an overwhelming power. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book a few years ago called David versus Goliath, and it was looking at all sorts of contemporary examples where the underdog wins, or that type of thing. And I don't think he was looking through the prism of God's divine providence, but nevertheless that idea is certainly prevalent and pervasive. But we'll begin with David being anointed as God's king, and we find this in the first 13 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 16. And it helps to have studied, I think, Saul beforehand. And Michelle raised the question about the sort of the timing of some of these things and the chronology, where David seems to be anointed. And then Saul doesn't seem to know him when he's sort of fighting Goliath, but I won't worry so much about that. The point is that in chapter 15 we see Saul incompletely obeying in the command to destroy the Amalekites, and then Samuel coming in and telling him what for, and then doing the job for him. And then in chapter 16, God says to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." So again, it's really important here to focus on the detail and to focus on the sort of small things that I think are still necessary. And again, we don't want to read too much into absolutely everything that's in the Bible, or draw all these sort of profound lessons where some of it's simply just straightforward description and things like that. But there can be a little consequence that he's going to Jesse in Bethlehem, and obviously we skip forward to Jesus, and Jesus famously is likewise in the end from Bethlehem, having to go there. And so, all these little things kind of join the dots for us and join these big overarching themes that we have. But it's also interesting that he's told to go and provided myself a king among his sons. So he doesn't say, go and find David. He's kind of leading Samuel on this journey himself. And I think we'll see the reason why in verse 7 here. And I think verse 7 is really the crux of this lesson tonight. And I think it's a really important verse in the sort of in terms of lessons, of moral lessons, of perspective that we can be given. It's not the only occasion where this lesson comes across, but I think it's a really important one and an oft-quoted verse for important reasons. But again, the context we set in verse 1 here, where he says, "I've provided myself a king among his sons." So there's still some sense of uncertainty of who this is. And so Samuel says, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." Saul obviously is the king, and we've seen he's prone to anger. But also, there is, even in this time, and we know in contemporary times, there's a very strong sense of monarchies being hereditary, of being I think they talk about the Windsors as sort of royal ink, or, a family affair, these sorts of things. And so, we know, and I'm sure there's people here who know a lot more about than me, but all of the lineage, and if it's not Charles, then it's got to be this person or that person. And then you have they talked about an heir and a spare that Charles and Diana have, and all of these sorts of things. And we see it with other European monarchies as well, and have seen it throughout history. But God isn't allowing a hereditary monarchy. It's not going to be passed to Jonathan or any of the other of Saul's sons. Generally, these are patriarchal things, but not necessarily, obviously. So I think, again, that's sort of interesting that God is still exercising his authority here. Once you become a hereditary monarchy, it doesn't really matter who God thinks should be king. It matters who your children is, and all these sorts of things. And we can see a bit later on, if we read through, Kings and Chronicles, and we see the kind of Game of Thrones style ways in which people try to shuffle for the throne, and we see, mothers ordering families to be wiped out and all of these sorts of things. So, hereditary monarchies get very messy, and of course there's no, the only authority one has is sort of being a member of a family. There's no inherent competence or reason to be a leader. And of course, we've seen many weak leaders assume thrones simply because of their birthright. And God is changing the rules here. And he says to Samuel, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And we've seen that Samuel is first and foremost a servant of God. And so, even the story, even after we've seen in chapter 15 how he stood up to Saul and how strong he was, that there's still, some trepidation there. There's still this idea of going against the king. Samuel is worried about this. And, we see Paul, even though his great strength and great faith, we see times in Acts where he is uncertain about going into certain places because he's worried or tired or fearful of the persecution that he's going to suffer. And so, Elijah, all sorts of people we see go through this. So it's okay to be a strong, faithful person and still, have a sense of your own preservation, self-preservation, and fear in wrath and the exercise of angry people. But God basically reassures him, as he does to Elijah, as he does to Paul. It's another great lesson we can learn, that God does look after his faithful, even though they may be fearful. And so they go and they basically have a sacrifice with Jesse. He says, I will show you what to do. You shall anoint for me for the one that I named to you. In verse 3, so Samuel, he goes to Bethlehem. The elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, do you come peaceably? So again, we have this sort of interlocking fears. Samuel is mindful of Saul, but also, again, this Samuel, the great sort of judge of the people, and he's just killed the king of the Amalekites. And so he says, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. Then he consecrated Jesse and invited them to the sacrifice. And so it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So Eliab is the firstborn son of Jesse. And so the Lord said to Samuel in verse 7, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And as I said, I'm sure this is a very familiar verse, but it's a familiar verse for a reason. It's expressing a profound truth. One of the great distinctions between God and man, between the ways in which we kind of default and the ways in which God is able to be that, piercing to the joint and marrow, and to see things in a completely different way. And so Eliab, we would assume, was a man of some, stature and presence, or maybe simply because he was the firstborn, and everyone knows that the firstborn children are always the best children, and so naturally one would assume that a firstborn child would be the one chosen. Now, if his name was Elias, then maybe he would be God's chosen one, but clearly they missed a consonant there, so he's clearly not the chosen one. And so it's really interesting. You'd think, why doesn't God just say, it's David? But he doesn't. They have this, what would you say, emu parade, or, they have this sort of parade of the sons that come through. And he says each time, verse 8, the Lord has, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Verse 9, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse made 7 of his sons pass. The Lord has not chosen these. And so Samuel says, are these all of your sons? And then Jesse says, well, no, the youngest isn't here, but, he's the youngest. He's not in the running. He's off and away. It's almost a bit like, Snow White or something, like the sort of, the one locked up in the attic somewhere. Well, we won't worry about her. She's not in the running to, be the prince or whatever. The point being is that, and so Samuel says, well, we're going to stand here until he comes, so you better go send for him. And so they do, and they bring him in. And it's really interesting in verse 12. So verse 7 says, I'm not looking at the appearance. Remember Saul, it was remarked upon that he was head and shoulders above everyone else, that his appearance seemed to be, somewhat striking. And they've done studies that people over 6 foot tall are so many percentage more likely to be, chief executive officers and so much more wealthier and these sorts of things, because we judge on appearance and we think because someone's taller, they must naturally be more assertive, more leadership characteristics, whatever it is. Poor old Zacchaeus is kind of almost not quite the butt of jokes, but he has a different story to tell than the likes of Saul. And yet in verse 12 we're told that David was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. So again, make of it what you will for why his sort of physical appearance is mentioned there. What's clear is that it's not simply his physical appearance that he's chosen, that we know that, and we see in verse 13, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And we know that this is in large part because David was a man after God's own heart. And so it's this idea of the heart, the seat of attitude, the seat of emotion, the seat, we talk about the heart as sort of encapsulating that sort of, that emotional self, the feelings, but also the way in which we can also, orientate our thoughts towards things, all of this kind of sense that's wrapped up in the heart. And that's what we're told quite explicitly that God looks at in sharp distinction, and that even though, Samuel himself, and we know that he was working with imperfect information like we all do, but nevertheless we're told that that Samuel, he seems quite taken by the first son, and God makes a point of saying at that point, no, don't be looking at those features. That's not how I judge people. That's not who I'm anointing as my next king. How deliberate this is, I'm not going to say absolutely it's cast iron, this is how it played out. But I think what we can clearly see is that Saul was anointed as king and fell away and led poorly, and the people suffered because of that, and the people could see this, and they could see the ignominy of his death, and how he sort of was almost shameful, the way in which the Philistines were able to treat him and his body at the end. And it's as if David is saying, well, you can see the folly of your choice. You have decided to have a king rather than me, and this was a mistake, and I'm telling you this is a mistake. And look at the first king we had. This is not a good way of going about things. And then the second king that God here is quite clearly and explicitly anointing. This isn't Samuel's decision making. There's no way in which we could read into this. David wasn't even there at the Emu parade. And as I said, they stepped through all 7 sons. And I think, again, this is God reinforcing this perspective, reinforcing this thing that, you're looking for characteristics that, to be fair, they can't necessarily see, or perhaps, God is pointing out that, you're looking in the wrong places, you're looking for the wrong things, just as Saul had the wrong characteristics in the end. And so, to bring in the boy from the field and to anoint him, I think is a shock to Jesse and his family. It's a shock to the elders, I'm sure, of Bethlehem. And it's a shock to Samuel himself, it would seem. But as things play out, we'll see, certainly in the initial phases, why this turns out to be, a wise choice, and why David does exercise this outsized influence over much of the Old Testament and into the time of Christ. And so, of course, we see this playing out really firstly and rather famously in the account of David and Goliath. This is a picture painted by Caravaggio, who was an Italian painter in the 1500s, and this is young David over Goliath. You can see the wound in his forehead that had felled him. Caravaggio painted 2 other pictures that are somewhat more graphic than this one. They're actually sort of holding his head. And again, it's, the Bible wasn't given to us illustrated. So these are not inspired pictures, images. I think we all understand that. But I think we also all understand, again, the sort of the momentous imagery and story that's contained in David and Goliath. I mean, as an origin story, as an expression of courage, as an expression of, ultimately and most importantly, faith in God, trust in God. It's all there. It's again, this isn't just sort of a sideline story. This is really the first time where we get to see David in full flight. And it's spectacular. And so we've encountered, we'll still go through the broad details just because we need to chew up time for a class. No, not just because of that. We'll go through the broad details because I think they are important and they are helpful to look at. And some of these stories can be so cliched, or we can parcel them off and leave them to Bible school classes, which is really important to teach them there. But they're also still really useful for us to look at. And I'm not saying we do it every Sunday, but I think revisiting some of these things and looking at the granular detail and understanding why they're included in Scripture, why they've become so iconic, so well known, so associated with the Bible, I think is helpful. And so we have chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, all 58 verses dedicated to this. And so without going through verse by verse, of course, we have the Philistines and Israel lined up against each other in conflict, as we have seen both in Judges but also in this time period, and Saul having some success at times, but also in this occasion that they are quite fearful. And they're fearful in part because of Goliath, who is their great warrior, it would seem, a giant of a man. And again, I'm sure if you can look on the internet, there's lots of speculation about how big he was and all of these sorts of things. We know that humans come in different sizes and that some men are very big and very intimidating and very good at fighting, and Goliath seems one of these fellows. And so we're told in verse 5 he had a bronze helmet. And again, God, through inspiration, includes his details. He could have just left it to be, but we're told that he had a bronze helmet, he was armed with a coat of mail, the weight of the coat, 5,000 shekels of bronze, had bronze armor on his legs, a bronze javelin between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. His iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. So remember, go back to the previous chapter, verse 7, men judges by their appearance, God judges by the heart. Everybody who sees this guy, who sees this appearance, is fearful, is afraid. Not only is he, a big hulking guy with lots of really scary armor, he mocks the people of Israel, the people of God. He says, "Why have you come out to line up for battle?" in verse 8. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And verse 11 is really instructive. It says, "Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid." So this is, again, the people of God, the people who God has continually delivered victories when they have trusted in him, and who has told them that I will be with you, I will protect you, and all of these sorts of things. And yet they continue to give in to fear. They continue to be intimidated by big guys in bright, shiny armor. And so then in verse 12, we have David entering the scene. And David comes down. Again, he's not there to fight in the battle. He comes down to give food to his brothers, his older brothers, who were there on these battle lines, part of the people that were fearful. And so David, hears this talk, hears this fear. So Goliath's out there for 40 days, mocking. Obviously, no one from Israel is prepared to take him on. And so, again in verse 24, we're told, "All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid." And so they say, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." So you could either fight Goliath because you trust in God, or you could fight Goliath for the rewards, for what Saul could pay you. And so David spoke to the man who stood by him, verse 26, and said, "What shall be done for the man who kills Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Notice the change in language. Notice the change in perspective here. That here you have people talking, they're all fearful and afraid that the only motivating factor for them is that you might get the girl and the house and the money, basically. And yet David here is punching to the heart of things. He's saying, this guy is insulting God and insulting the people of God. This isn't right. Who is he to do this? And so, and then we have this classic, a bit like Joseph in times before, and his older brothers kind of getting really narky at Joseph. It's not a biblical term, but you understand. And then Eliab, he hears what David's on about, and he gets angry with David, and he says, "Why have you come down here? Why have you left those sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David says, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Classic older brother, younger brother sort of interaction, I think. And so then we have in verse 31, the words which David spoke were heard, and they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And so again, listen to what David says to Saul. This is the king. David's still young here. He's still, not the man that he's going to be. But he says, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul says, "You're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him. You're a youth. He's a man of war from his youth." Again, go back to previous chapter 16 and verse 7. Keep seeing things from the shallow perspective, from the immediate things. Saul is doing it. Saul's army is doing it. David's older brothers are doing it. All they can see is, the same fear that the 10 spies saw when they went into Canaan. The same things that we see over and again, where people's faith fail. And David says to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and a lion or bear came out. I went out and I struck it." And he says in verse 36, "I've done these things, and then I've killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Again, you see David's motivation, you see his perspective, you see how he sees the world, how different it is to all those round about him. And then Saul says to David, "Go and the Lord be with you." And then Saul clothes David with his armor and his helmet and his coat of mail, and then his sword. And David says, "I can't walk with these. I've not tested them." So David took them off, as if putting this armor on was the thing that was going to defeat Goliath. It's David's attitude. It's David's trust. It's David's offense on behalf of God. That's what's taking him to this battle. And again, the classic thing, we better arm you up to the hilt, as if, Goliath wouldn't really worry. I think, one clubbing from Goliath is going to get through whatever armor he puts on. And you could just imagine the kind of, remember Saul was head and shoulders above the rest. And so Saul's armor put on David, he's probably, wandering around, helmet on his head. And I could imagine quite a comic scene coming about. But nevertheless, famously then, David takes his staff and he chooses for himself 5 stones. Again, look at the detail. Why does he choose 5 stones? He's only going to need 1, isn't he? Is this insurance? Is it kind of a deception? Is it just that was what his practice was? Again, it probably doesn't matter. But it's certainly not the armor that Goliath is wearing and that Saul thinks that he should need. These famous 5 smooth stones. And then the Philistine comes at him again and he says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine said, "Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." God's people have always been insulted and mocked. And Jesus warns us, doesn't he, in Matthew chapter 5, that you will be persecuted because of my name. You will suffer as a Christian. And you have to be okay with that. And then actually you'll be blessed because of these things. And then this speech that David gives is really wonderful. And I think it's why we want to come back and study the actual words that are here and not just the idea of David and Goliath. David says to this Philistine that everyone else was afraid of and would only fight if they could get money and girls out of it. He says, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Pretty rousing stuff. You could imagine this is kind of the culmination here. I probably shouldn't keep comparing the Bible to Hollywood movies, but, like every script writer would be jealous of something like this. This throws Shakespeare out of the water. Like this is, and again, I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm trying to say this confidence comes from David's perspective. And again, he draws this contrast. He draws this contrast that God had drawn back in chapter 16 and verse 7, where he says, "Do not look at the outward things, look at the heart." And David is acting in this same way. He says, you've put all of your trust in your javelin and your spear and your sword and your great strength and might. And guess what? That spooked everyone else in an army, because they're all looking at the same thing and they're all thinking they should be trusting in the same thing. And they know that their sword and shield and muscles don't beat Goliath's sword and shield and muscles. Of course they don't. But David's not fighting that fight. He's fighting a fight of faith. He's fighting a fight of trust, of confidence, of believing in what God has said. And so when we read that David is a man after God's own heart, this shows it, this proves it. This says when it matters most, when everyone else who could also be a man after God's own heart and isn't, is timid and fearful and allowing Goliath to spout off for 40 days. This is what it looks like. This is what faith looks like. This is what the moment looks like. And of course, Goliath comes at him and he famously puts a stone in his forehead and fells him on his face to the earth. And then, to make sure that the Philistines get it, he comes in with his own sword, with Goliath's own sword, lops off his head, and the Philistines flee. And all of a sudden, the armies of Israel have great confidence and they start chasing them. And nothing like leadership, is there? Nothing like a demonstration of faith and the fruit of those things and what difference that can make. The point, of course, yes, it's great art, it's great stories to teach kids, but ultimately it's a great lesson for us in looking not at the things that make us afraid, not at the things that are difficult, not at the surface things, not at the immediate things, but looking at the important things, looking at the things of the heart. And it's the same lesson that gets taught in the New Testament. In James chapter 2, we see James having to remind people that you bring people into the church who have all the gold and all the finery, all the external things, all of the things that Eliab seemed to have, all of the things that Saul seemed to have, and you give them the prominent place in the church. And the person who's not quite looking like that and on hard times or whatnot, kind of you sit over in the corner and, this person, they look really important, so they must be right. Again and again and again, God has to puncture this and God has to say, it's the heart that matters, not the things that you want to immediately associate with. And so as we conclude tonight, this is the question we want to answer. Do I do this? Do I look at outward appearance? Do I make judgments in this way? How can I learn to look as God looks? Bearing in mind, yes, we don't have the same capabilities, of course, but we can adopt a way of seeing. We can see that David adopted this in his own self and was able to exercise this in the choices he made and in the boldness that he showed. Thanks very much.